The icy wind cut through General George Washington's worn coat like a blade as he stood on the banks of the Delaware River, staring across at the enemy-held territory of New Jersey. It was December 26, 1776, and the Continental Army was dying not from British bullets, but from despair, disease, and desertion. Blood from frostbitten feet stained the snow behind his retreating forces, marking a trail of suffering that threatened to end the American Revolution before it truly began. Washington's army had shrunk from 20,000 men to fewer than 3,000 enlistments were expiring with the new year, just days away. The British and their Hessian allies controlled New York. Philadelphia seemed within their grasp. Many colonists were beginning to question whether independence was worth this terrible price. The general knew that without a victory soon the cause would collapse like a house of cards in winter wind. The surprise attack on Trenton had provided a brief spark of hope. His ragged Continentals had crossed the ice-choked Delaware on Christmas night, catching the Hessian garrison. Completely off guard, the victory was sweet, but Washington understood its limitations. One battle did not make a revolution, and British General Charles Cornwallis was already marshalling forces to crush this impudent colonial uprising once and for all, as reports filtered in from his scouts. Washington learned that Cornwallis himself was advancing with 8,000 seasoned troops. The British general had left his planned departure for England, determined to personally end Washington's military career and the rebellion with it. Time was running short, and the Continental Army found itself trapped between the advancing British forces and the treacherous river crossing that had served them so well just days before. The soldiers huddled around their meager campfires spoke, in hushed tones, of home, family, and the warm beds they had left behind. Many had not been paid in months. Their uniforms were little more than rags. Their weapons were a motley collection of muskets, hunting rifles, and whatever else they could find. Yet something in their commander's bearing kept them from complete despair. Washington moved among them, his presence alone worth a dozen reinforcements. According to historical accounts from the Library of Congress archives, Washington faced perhaps the most critical decision of his military career in those final days of 1776. Intelligence reports suggested that British forces were converging on his position, while his own army dwindled daily as enlistments expired and men simply walked away into the frozen landscape. The general called a council of war in his headquarters, a modest farmhouse that provided little protection from the bitter cold. His officers gathered around a crude wooden table, their breath visible in the frigid air. Maps of New Jersey lay spread before them, marked with the positions of enemy forces and the few remaining options for the Continental Army. The room fell silent as Washington began to speak, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision before them. Outside, sentries paced their beats, eyes straining through the darkness for signs of the approaching enemy. The fate of a nation hung in the balance, balanced on the edge of a blade as sharp and cold as the January wind that howled through the bare branches overhead. Dawn broke gray and sullen over the New Jersey countryside on January 2nd, 1777, revealing the dust clouds of Cornwallis's advancing army. British scouts had located Washington's position, and the trap was closing with mechanical precision. The young American nation's military leader stood at his window, watching as red-coated figures appeared on distant hills like drops of blood. Against the winter landscape, Cornwallis had divided his forces into 3 columns, moving with the confidence of a predator certain of its prey. The main body of 5,000 troops advanced directly toward Washington's position at Trenton, while flanking forces moved to cut off potential escape routes. The British general had learned from the Christmas surprise this time. There would be no overlooking the Americans' capacity for unconventional warfare. Washington's officers pressed him to retreat across the Delaware once more, thought to preserve what remained of the Continental Army for future battles. Colonel Joseph Reed argued passionately that discretion was the better part of valor, that losing the army would mean losing the war. But Washington had studied his maps through the night, and a desperate plan was forming in his mind that would either save the revolution or destroy it completely. The American forces numbered barely 3,000 effective soldiers. of them militia who had never faced British regulars in open combat. Their artillery consisted of a handful of cannon commanded by a young captain named Alexander Hamilton, whose mathematical precision in gunnery had caught Washington's attention. During the Trenton raid, these guns would prove crucial in the coming hours, though none of them yet knew it, as British forces deployed in battle formation. Washington made a decision that defied conventional military wisdom. Instead of retreating, he would divide his already small army. The main force would continue to face Cornwallis at Trenton, maintaining the illusion of a trapped and desperate enemy. Meanwhile, a smaller force would attempt something unprecedented, a night march around the British flank to strike at Princeton, where enemy reinforcements and supplies were concentrated. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. Troops at night through unfamiliar territory in winter conditions, while maintaining absolute silence to avoid detection, would challenge even veteran soldiers. Washington's men were exhausted, hungry, and many were barely equipped for such an undertaking. Yet the alternative was almost certain defeat and the end of American independence. General Hugh Mercer, a Scottish physician turned soldier, volunteered to lead the advance guard toward Princeton. His weathered face showed the strain of months of retreat and hardship, but his eyes still held the fire that had driven him to join the colonial cause. Mercer understood, perhaps better than most, that medicine sometimes required drastic treatment to save the patient. As darkness fell on January 2nd, Washington began the most dangerous gambit of his military career. Campfires were kept burning to deceive British sentries, while the bulk of his army quietly slipped away from their positions. The night was clear and cold, with enough moonlight to guide their movement, but not so bright as to expose them to enemy observation. The march toward Princeton began with whispered commands, and the muffled sound of hundreds of feet on frozen ground. Behind them, a skeleton force maintained the deception at Trenton, hoping to convince Cornwallis that the entire Continental Army remained trapped and awaiting destruction. Ahead lay 12 miles of treacherous terrain and the possibility of annihilation if they were discovered. The frozen ground crunched beneath thousands of boots as Washington's army moved through the darkness like a ghost force, their breath-forming clouds in the bitter January air. Every step carried them further from safety and deeper into enemy territory, where discovery would mean certain destruction. The general rode at the head of his columns, his presence a beacon of determination for men who had already endured more than any soldier should be asked to bear. General Mercer's advance guard pressed forward along the Quaker Road, the most direct route to Princeton. Behind them, the main body of Continental troops followed in silent formation, their weapons wrapped in cloth to prevent metallic sounds from betraying their position. Artillery pieces rolled forward on muffled wheels, each cannon representing precious firepower that could not be replaced if lost. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and many soldiers lacked proper winter clothing. Some wrapped their feet in rags, leaving bloody footprints in the snow that marked their passage, like a crimson thread through the New Jersey wilderness. Yet they continued marching, driven by something stronger than comfort or self-preservation, belief that their sacrifice might birth a new nation. Washington knew that Cornwallis would discover the deception at Trenton by dawn. British patrols would find the abandoned positions, the cold campfires, the evidence of departure. When that happened, the enemy general would realize he had been outwitted and would immediately dispatch forces to intercept the Americans. Speed was essential, but so was stealth, creating a delicate balance that tested every commander's skill as they approached Stony Brook. The army encountered their first serious obstacle. The creek was partially frozen, but not solid enough to support artillery and supply wagons. Engineers worked frantically to strengthen the ice crossing while precious minutes ticked away. The sound of axes and hammers echoed in the cold air, each noise a potential betrayal of their position to enemy scouts. Lieutenant James Monroe, serving as a reconnaissance officer, reported back from the advance scouts with troubling news. British forces were stirring in Princeton. Whether from routine patrol activity or awareness of approaching danger remained unclear. The young officer, who would later become America's 5th president, bore the weight of information that could determine the battle's outcome. Colonel John Hazlitt's Delaware Regiment formed the vanguard as they cleared the creek crossing and continued toward Princeton. These men had fought at Long Island, survived the retreat through New York, and crossed the Delaware on Christmas night. They represented the backbone of Washington's army, professional soldiers who had chosen to remain when militia went home and fair-weather patriots abandoned the cause. The landscape around them showed signs of war's passage. Abandoned farms dotted the countryside, their owners fled or dead, their fields trampled by marching armies. Fences had been torn down for firewood, livestock slaughtered or driven off, and the peaceful colonial life of just 2 years before seemed like a memory from another world entirely, according to research from the National Archives. Washington's night march to Princeton represented one of the most daring tactical movements in military history, comparable to Hannibal's crossing of the Alps or Napoleon's Italian campaigns. The American commander was attempting to achieve through audacity what he could never accomplish through superior numbers or equipment. As the first hint of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, the Continental Army approached the outskirts of Princeton. Ahead lay the town that housed British reinforcements, supplies, and the promise of victory or catastrophe. The soldiers checked their weapons one final time, knowing that in moments they would either vindicate their long suffering or die in the attempt. The pale winter sun crested the horizon as General Mercer's advance guard encountered British forces south of Princeton near the William Clark Farm. What began as a chance meeting between patrols quickly erupted into the opening. Shots of a battle that would determine America's future. The crack of musket fire shattered the morning stillness, and the careful plans of both armies dissolved into the chaos of combat. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mohood had led the 17th Regiment of Foot out of Princeton that morning, heading toward Trenton to reinforce Cornwallis. His men were seasoned professionals, veterans of campaigns across the empire, and they moved with the confidence of soldiers who had rarely tasted defeat. When they spotted Mercer's approaching colonials, Mohood immediately deployed his troops for battle, certain that a quick demonstration of British steel would scatter these amateur rebels, Mercer's men, mostly Pennsylvania militia and Continental regulars, took position behind a rail fence and began trading volleys with the British line. The Scottish general moved among his troops, encouraging them with words and personal example, his sword gleaming in the morning light. For several minutes, the battle remained even, with both sides maintaining disciplined fire despite mounting casualties. The British possessed superior training and equipment, but the Americans fought with the desperation of men who knew retreat meant the death of their cause. Musket balls whined through the cold air, and the acrid smoke of gunpowder began to obscure the battlefield. Men fell on both sides, their blood staining the frozen ground and spreading crimson pools. Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery battery unlimbered near the Quaker Meeting House, adding the thunder of cannon fire to the growing battle. The young West Indian's mathematical precision with artillery would prove crucial in the coming hours. His guns swept British formations with devastating effect. Each cannonball tore through enemy ranks, but the British lines reformed with practiced efficiency. The tide of battle turned when British reinforcements arrived from Princeton, forcing Mercer's outnumbered men to fall back across an open field. As they retreated, disaster-struck General Mercer's horse was shot from under him, and the veteran officer found himself surrounded by British bayonets. He fought desperately with his sword, but enemy steel found its mark, and one of Washington's most trusted commanders fell mortally wounded. The sight of Mercer falling sent panic through the American ranks. Men who had stood firm under musket fire began to break and run when they saw their general struck down. The British pressed their advantage, advancing with fixed bayonets and the terrifying war cries that had broken enemy. Formations from India to the Caribbean, Washington heard the sound of battle and spurred his horse toward the fighting, knowing that defeat here would mean the end of everything they had fought for. As he crested a small hill, he could see his men streaming back in disorder, pursued by disciplined British infantry. The moment of crisis had arrived, with it the test of his leadership. The general's appearance on the battlefield electrified the retreating Americans. Here was the man who had led them across the Delaware, who had shared their sufferings through the long retreat, who embodied their hopes for independence. His calm presence began to steady the wavering lines, but the British advance continued, threatening to overwhelm the colonial position entirely. Captain John Fleming of the Virginia Regiment later described, writing that the general appeared like an angel of deliverance when all seemed lost. The commander immediately began reorganizing the scattered forces, placing fresh troops where they were most needed and preparing for what could be the final stand of the Continental Army. Artillery fire from both sides intensified as the British brought their own guns into action. The thunder of cannon mixed with the crack of musketry and the cries of wounded men, creating a symphony of war that echoed across the Princeton countryside. Farmhouses became fortresses, stone walls turned into defensive positions, and every rise of ground became contested territory in the struggle for America's future. With Mercer fallen and panic spreading through the American ranks, Washington made a decision that defied every principle of military caution. Rather than attempting to rally his men from a safe distance, the commander-in-chief spurred his horse directly toward the British lines, placing himself within musket range of enemy soldiers who would have given anything for a shot at the rebel. "Leader, parade with us, my brave fellows," Washington shouted above the din of battle, his voice carrying across the field with remarkable clarity. "There's but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." His words were as much prayer as command, for he could see the overwhelming British force advancing with bayonets fixed and battle flags flying. The general's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel John Fitzgerald, later wrote that he covered his eyes, unable to watch what seemed certain to be Washington's death. When the British volley erupted in smoke and flame, Fitzgerald expected to see his commander fall. Instead, Washington emerged from the cloud unscathed, still shouting encouragement to his men and somehow transforming retreat into advance through sheer force of will. Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, led a cavalry charge that struck the British flank at precisely the right moment. His horsemen, though few in number, created chaos in the enemy ranks and provided the breathing space needed for the Continental infantry to reform. The young captain's sabers gleamed in the morning sun as they cut through British resistance. With devastating effect, Colonel John Cadwallader's Philadelphia militia, who had crossed the Delaware separately, arrived on the battlefield at the crucial moment. These citizen soldiers had marched through the night to reach Princeton. Their fresh troops provided the reinforcement Washington desperately needed. Their arrival transformed the tactical situation from desperate defense to possible victory. The tide of battle shifted as American artillery found its range. Hamilton's guns, positioned with mathematical precision, began to tear gaps in the British formations. Each cannon shot was carefully aimed, making every ball count in a battle where ammunition was precious and victory hung by a thread. The young artillery captain's commands rang out with cool professionalism. Despite the chaos surrounding his battery, British resistance began to crumble. As American pressure mounted from multiple directions, Lieutenant Colonel Mawhood, who had begun the battle confident of easy victory, found his veteran troops pressed back toward Princeton by determined colonial forces. The professional soldiers who had conquered half the world were being outfought by American farmers and merchants turned warriors. The psychological impact of Washington's personal leadership cannot be overstated. Soldiers who had been ready to flee moments before now pressed forward with renewed determination. The sight of their commander sharing their dangers, exposing himself to enemy fire, convinced them that this battle was worth winning regardless of the cost. Nassau Hall, the pride of Princeton University, became a fortress as British forces retreated into the substantial stone building. American artillery turned their attention to this last bastion of resistance, with Captain Hamilton personally aiming his cannon at the structure. The symbolic impact was as important as the tactical necessity the Temple of Learning had become. A battlefield and the future of American education hung in the balance. As resistance collapsed, British forces began surrendering in increasing numbers. The professional soldiers who had seemed invincible just hours before now threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Hood managed to escape with a portion of his command, but the bulk of the Princeton garrison was captured, along with valuable supplies and equipment. The transformation was complete. In less than 2 hours, Washington had converted potential disaster into stunning victory. The same army that had fled in panic was now pursuing defeated enemies, capturing prisoners. In securing the strategic town of Princeton, the impossible had become reality through leadership, courage, and the desperate determination of men fighting for their freedom. The smoke of battle gradually cleared over Princeton as Washington's men secured their hard-won prize. British prisoners sat dejected under guard while American soldiers gathered weapons, supplies, and equipment that would prove invaluable to the Continental cause. The captured artillery pieces would strengthen Washington's firepower, while the munitions and food stores would help sustain his army through the difficult winter ahead. General Cornwallis received word of the Princeton disaster while still at Kansa. Trenton, searching for the American army he believed trapped, the British commander's confident pursuit had turned into humiliating failure, and he now faced the reality that Washington had completely outmaneuvered him. The rebel leader had not only escaped destruction, but had struck a devastating blow. At British prestige and strategic position, the casualties told the story of the battle's intensity. General Mercer lay dying from his wounds, his sacrifice representative of the price paid for American independence. Captain John Fleming recorded that 23 Americans died at Princeton, while British losses exceeded 100 killed, wounded, and captured. More importantly, the psychological impact far exceeded the raw numbers the Continental Army had proven it could defeat. British regulars in open combat. Washington faced a crucial decision as his men celebrated their victory. Reports indicated that British reinforcements were converging on Princeton from multiple directions, and his exhausted army could not withstand another major engagement. The temptation to pursue his advantage was strong, but the prudent course was to withdraw with his prizes before enemy forces could trap him. The march to Morristown began immediately, with captured supplies loaded onto wagons and British prisoners. Formed into columns under guard, Washington had selected this location months earlier as a potential winter headquarters, and its strategic position would allow him to threaten British communications while keeping his army intact for future operations. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton supervised the removal of captured artillery, ensuring that every valuable piece reached American lines. The young officer's mathematical mind had proven as useful in logistics as in gunnery, and his growing reputation would soon earn him a position on Washington's staff. These captured guns would serve the Continental cause in battles yet to come. As the American army departed Princeton, residents began emerging from their homes to witness the aftermath of battle. Many had fled when fighting began, but others had watched from cellars and attics as their quiet college town became a battlefield. The sight of British prisoners and American victors marching together told them that something fundamental had changed in their war. The news of Princeton's fall spread rapidly through New Jersey and beyond. Loyalist sympathizers who had welcomed British protection now faced the reality that Washington's army remained a potent force. Patriots who had despaired after months of defeat suddenly found new hope. Recruitment for the Continental cause began to increase dramatically. According to historical records from the Princeton Battlefield Society, engagement at Princeton marked a crucial turning point in American morale and international perception of the conflict. European observers, particularly in France, began to view the colonial rebellion as a potentially successful war of independence rather than a doomed uprising. Captain William Washington recovered from wounds received during his cavalry charge, but his courage in the battle had earned him lasting recognition. His horsemen had struck at precisely the right moment, demonstrating that American forces could coordinate complex tactical movements under pressure. The success at Princeton proved that Washington's army was becoming a professional fighting force. The British evacuation of Princeton was only the beginning. News of the defeat forced enemy commanders to reconsider their entire strategy in New Jersey, ultimately leading to the abandonment of numerous outposts and a concentration of forces in defensive positions. Washington's audacious gamble had not only saved his army, but had fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the region. As evening fell on January 3, 1777, the Continental Army settled into defensive positions around Morristown. Behind them lay a trail of victory that had seemed impossible just 48 hours earlier. Ahead stretched the uncertain path to independence. But now that path seemed achievable rather than merely a desperate dream. The victory at Princeton reverberated far beyond the frozen fields of New Jersey, transforming what had been a failing rebellion into a legitimate war of independence. In the weeks following the battle, recruitment for the Continental Army surged, as colonists who had remained neutral suddenly found the courage to take sides. The impossible had become possible, and America began to believe in its destiny. General Washington established his winter headquarters in Morristown, using the strategic position to maintain pressure on British forces while allowing his army to recover from months of hardship. The captured supplies from Princeton helped sustain his troops through the bitter winter. While the psychological boost of victory proved even more valuable than material gains, the death of General Hugh Mercer became a rallying cry for the American cause. The Scottish physician-turned-warrior had given his life for his adopted country, and his sacrifice inspired others to similar dedication. Memorial services throughout the colonies honored his memory, while recruitment officers used his example to encourage enlistment in the Continental cause. European reaction to Princeton was swift and significant. French Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes began serious consideration of supporting the American rebellion, recognizing that Washington's victory suggested the colonists might actually achieve independence. Spanish and Dutch observers also took note, understanding that British defeat in America could reshape the global balance of power. The British High Command in London faced uncomfortable questions about their conduct of the American war. How had a ragtag colonial army outmaneuvered professional soldiers? How had Washington escaped certain destruction and turned the tables so completely? The answers suggested that traditional European warfare might not be adequate for conquering America. Captain Alexander Hamilton's performance at Princeton earned him appointment to Washington's staff, beginning a relationship that would shape both men's careers. The young artillery officer's combination of intellectual brilliance and battlefield courage made him invaluable to the commander-in-chief. And his rise through the ranks exemplified the opportunities that revolution created for talented individuals. Strategic consequences of Princeton extended far beyond immediate tactical gains. British forces evacuated numerous outposts throughout New Jersey, concentrating in defensive positions around New York and Philadelphia. This withdrawal allowed Washington to establish secure winter quarters while maintaining pressure on enemy communications and supply lines. Colonial newspapers celebrated the victory with headlines that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The Pennsylvania Journal proclaimed that the glorious cause of American liberty had achieved its most significant triumph, while the Boston Gazette declared that Washington had proven himself the equal of any general in history. Public morale soared as victory replaced the despair of recent defeats. The battle's impact on military thinking was equally profound. European military observers studying the Princeton campaign noted Washington's innovative use of night marches, his willingness to divide forces in the face of superior enemies, and his personal leadership under fire. These tactics would influence military doctrine for generations to come as spring approached. The Continental Army emerged from winter quarters stronger and more confident than ever before. The victories at Trenton and Princeton had transformed demoralized refugees into professional soldiers, while Washington's leadership had evolved from competent to inspired. The revolution that had nearly died in the winter of 1776 was now positioned to challenge the British Empire itself. The Battle of Princeton became a symbol of American determination and ingenuity. Against overwhelming odds, through careful planning and desperate courage, Washington had snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. The lesson resonated throughout American history that free people fighting for their rights could overcome any enemy, no matter how powerful or professional. The young nation that emerged from those frozen fields near Princeton carried within it the DNA of that victory, the belief that American audacity, combined with righteous purpose, could accomplish the impossible. The battle had changed more than military fortunes. It had forged the character of a people and pointed them toward their destiny as a free and independent nation.